Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our hope. Amen. There are so many stories in the Bible of Jesus sharing a meal with people. We've kind of talked about this a bit before, and you've undoubtedly heard me say, not only are there many stories of Jesus breaking bread with people, of sharing a meal, being at table with people in the Bible, I think there are many, 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 many more. It's just that including all of them, first of all, would have made the gospel narratives horrendously long, but also horrendously boring, because in all likelihood, Jesus would have had conversations with people which he had again and again and again, and we would have simply been hearing, oh no, not another story of Jesus sharing a meal with people. So we include the ones that are important, and this one is important. It's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's important because Jesus has gone to the house of the leader of the Pharisees, the very people who are, well, as it says, watching him closely, the very people who are upset and concerned about what Jesus is teaching and the number of people that are listening to Jesus, especially when he talks about how the Pharisees are not authentic, that they're not good leaders, that they are following the letter of the law and not the intent, that they are not authentic in their prayers to God and their celebrations of the rituals. And here he is going to the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees. So I have a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, one is, if you have this idea that Jesus thinks all the Pharisees are bad, maybe this one isn't. Maybe this is one of the Pharisees that actually are listening to Jesus, and it's, again, a reminder that it's not fair to generalize and suggest that all of the Pharisees are bad. Secondly, though, it does say they were watching him closely. So it may well be exactly the opposite. It may well be that this is one of those Pharisees that definitely has it in for Jesus and he's trying to set him up. Except the story doesn't unfold like that. In fact, we hear this verse about Jesus is going to the house of the leader of the Pharisees, and then the very next thing, we've jumped ahead a few verses to Jesus being in the room and seeing who's going to sit where thing. Those verses that are missing, those got left out in the lectionary reading simply because it's another story, like last week, of Jesus healing somebody on the Sabbath. As Jesus approaches the Pharisee's house, he meets someone who is sick and he heals them on the Sabbath, and then of course immediately challenges the Pharisees to say, is it okay that I healed somebody on the Sabbath? Pharisees, are you paying attention? And then it goes ahead into this story about them being at table. And we just had a story about, is it okay to heal on the Sabbath? And we talked about that. So that was left out in the lectionary reading. Also, to make the point that this isn't the reason you're hearing the story. The reason you're hearing the story is because when they gather at the table, Jesus himself is watching closely to see where people sit. Now, there are two ways to look at this story, I think. One is, it's another one of these stories about there is hierarchy and structure, and Jesus is about to break it down by pointing out that there shouldn't be places where certain people get to sit. But it isn't one of those. It isn't that at all. In fact, it is a Sabbath meal, and a Sabbath meal has structure. It has, it's a ritual. It has certain people involved in doing certain things. Certain people are intended to sit in certain places, and on top of that, you're in somebody else's house. Now, the last time I was over at somebody's house for a meal, and there was a group of us, we all stood around waiting for the host to tell us where to sit. Because that's what you do. You sit where the host tells you to sit. And Jesus right away says, but what if you didn't? What if you were rude enough to presume that you should sit in a certain place? at this meal that has structure and places where certain people are supposed to sit? What if you went ahead and just sat where you thought you should? Because, it's all about you, isn't it? And that's just the point that Jesus is trying to make, I think, is that he's trying to point out that you should wait and sit where you are asked to sit by your host. First of all, because it's the host who is intending to have this group gathering. And secondly, don't presume that you are so important as to have the seat of honor. That seems, I think, almost obvious. And yet here's Jesus trying to make the point. Perhaps today we've come to a point where people don't necessarily sit in places of honor, like there's no structure around the table. Certainly, I hope that there is no structure around this table, that we sit where we sit because that's where we sit. It's not a question of there being a hierarchy or places of honor which you should sit. You should sit where you are comfortable, where you can hear and see, where you have access to a seat. In fact, we should give priority to those who find it difficult perhaps to find a seat on their own. But in any case, the point is that we have equity at the table. We are all welcome to the table, and we all have a place. Back in the day, before we had pews, and before we had this almost adversarial, I'm up here, you're out there thing happening. The table is here, and you sit and watch, because that's how it used to be. We've got a thing going on up here. You are watching what's happening. You're not supposed to be part of it. The priest is supposed to do it. In fact, there was a day where the priest was and the altar was separated by a screen from the people to keep you out, because this is unique and special to those who have the honor of being here, priests. But for us today, this is a table. And it's not just a table for certain people. It's not just a United Church table. It's the table of Jesus, and all are welcome at the table of Jesus. And the thing about that I always find really interesting is if you go back long before we had pews, long before we all just crowded in to see where we could go, bearing in mind, of course, that the people who had status and wealth got to be at the front, if indeed they didn't have their own private little booth thing happening. Back long before that, when people first gathered in the earliest churches in the basilicas, the table was in the middle of the people. And we all gathered literally around the table. We say it as a metaphor now because, us and them thing happening here. But back in the day, in the earliest days of the church, people gathered literally around the table. And as you did, it meant you were all one next to the other, next to the other, next to the other. And it didn't matter who you were or how you were. It didn't matter how much money you had or property. It didn't matter. You stood next to whoever was standing next to you. Now, I think that's kind of where we are in terms of the seating thing now, right? We have seats, of course, because, we wouldn't want you to have to stand for an hour. Bearing in mind that back in the day, when people stood around the table in the early centuries of the church, those services could last hours because it would include teaching and communion and everything, every time. But the point is, as we say the words now, gather round the table, there was a time when we literally did. And that was so meaningful because there was equity around the table. And that's the next piece of this story, isn't it? As Jesus goes on to say, when you have a banquet, when you have a feast, don't invite the people who can repay you, who can invite you over to their place next. Invite the poor and the hungry and the sick, the marginalized. Invite those who don't get an invitation, who can't repay you. To offer that kindness and generosity. These two pieces, the idea of there being a sense of where should I sit because I'm important, or I should wait to be told where to sit because I'm no more important than the next person, and who gets to be invited to the feast, are connected by something. And they're connected by humility. They're connected by what's true at the heart of being humble, which isn't just about thinking, it's not about thinking, oh no, I am not worthy. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You are worthy. And what you are worthy of is sharing with others this sense of God's presence and the divine spirit being here, this sense of connectedness with God. And we do it together. And we share at the table with equity, not just equality, which is just, we're all going to start from this moment the same. Equity, which means everyone has what they need. That might mean that those who find it difficult to get close to the table might be helped to the table. And those who find it easy to come to the table might help those who don't, might help others to come. At this table of Jesus, we invite everyone, whoever you are, however you are. We invite people to come to the table, not just metaphorically, but quite literally, and there are ways that we can do that. In Ponoka, for instance, there's a community lunch, which, by the way, shout out to Charlotte, because she's the one who organizes that, and she gets people from the community to come and be involved in it. And we have it at the church. And anyone can come. And what's coolest about it is it's not just street people who come, people who live on the street. It's not just people who don't have money. It's also people who are lonely and just need to be with people. It's also people who just want to get out and do something. It's everyone. It's a whole measure of people. And they sit together at tables and they enjoy a lunch which is provided to them without cost in any way. That is what happens here. All are welcome to this table, and what is provided is without cost, because we are all worthy of being at the table. What brings us here is Jesus. What brings us here is what Jesus is all about. Love, compassion, grace, humility, in the best, truest sense of the word.